Hello and welcome to The Law Street, presented by Legal League Consulting in association with ET Now. This is the season's last episode, and in this episode we're going to talk about outbound investments and how Indian corporates are gearing up for shopping abroad and how the government has put in place a facilitative environment for them to shop abroad. And to throw more light on that front, we're joined by three leading legal experts. I have with me, joining me in the Mumbai studios, Mr. Rajeev Uberoi, Group General Counsel at IDFC Bank, Mr. Ashok Lalwani, Principal Baker McKenzie, and joining me out of the studios in New Delhi, we have Shahana Basu, Director, Legal and Regulatory Affairs, Max India. To all of you, welcome to the Law Street. Mr. Uberoi, let's kickstart today's proceedings with you. Outbound investments from India have undergone a drastic change, both in terms of magnitude and also in terms of some of the geographies where Indians have been looking out for acquisitions. What are your thoughts on this, and what are some of the trends that you can capture for us?
If you look at the outbound investments, since liberalization 91, there have been a lot of regulations which have come. It was only after the turn of this century, after 2001-2, when we saw the ODI going up in India, and there were regulations which facilitated them. The trends which have been shown is that initially there was a huge amount of outbound investment in CIS countries. And rightly so, because India were investing in Russia and other places where they could get oil. But from the corporate India point of view, it was few companies or few large houses which were going for ODI, especially in the Southeast Asia and also in Africa. Since 2008, after you had the meltdown, a lot of assets outside India became very attractive for Indian companies. And a huge amount of investment went into Europe, especially Eastern Europe, African countries, and also as far as Latin America, where certain assets which were not as expensive became very, very attractive for Indian investors. If you look at the trend which has been following, initially there were a huge amount of investments getting into areas like Mauritius, Netherlands, but these were more for the point of view of having a holding company and then investing overseas because of their tax benefits and all. However, in the last couple of years, there has been a huge amount of overseas investment for Indian companies to acquire raw material, whether it is oil, whether it is coal, which has been a large ticket things. On the local side, smaller companies, the sunrise industries, after they have satiated their needs and demand in the country, they go overseas. Either they have captive business model there, or they find that there's an opportunity there. And coupled with the India's regulatory requirements, and if you know that all outbound investments are monitored under the Act of FEMA. Under FEMA, Section 6 allows Reserve Bank of India to make regulations to allow Indian companies to invest overseas. Now that has become more liberalized, which has made Indian companies to go overseas and acquire assets or have joint ventures or have got these subsidiaries.
We'll get back to that and the regulations in the later part of the show. But Ashok, I want to get your thoughts over here. Do you concur with Rajeev when he says that pharma, IT, FMCG, these are some of the sunrise sectors where there is considerable interest to acquire assets abroad? What's your experience in this regard?
No, I would agree fully. I think in terms of what we have seen in terms of outbound transactions, those are the sectors where we've seen the largest number of outbound transactions. The other thing we've seen is the continued focus on energy assets and minerals. So that number tends to outplay most other numbers. The deals tend to be a lot larger, and so you still have a lot of corporates who are in the sort of the growth sectors, infrastructure and the like. They're still looking for energy assets. But then you also have these up-and-coming new risers that are looking at either growth opportunities, technology, or manufacturing capabilities, and just new markets. So you do see Indian corporates going far and wide for a variety of assets.
All right. Now, Shahana, you've heard out both Ashok and Rajeev. What are your thoughts in this regard, and what do you think is the reason why India is perhaps one of the most active Asian economies when it comes to outbound investments?
I think I totally agree with my two other colleagues, and to just say that I think initially the investments were more out of by Indian companies more into US, UK, and now more recently, of course, into Africa and Latin America. And in the US in particular, I would like to agree that it's more on the IT side and also on pharmaceuticals. For example, even in the last couple of years, you've seen, for example, Lupin acquiring Gavis Pharmaceuticals in an $880 million deal. You have Cipla acquiring two other generic drug makers. So many deals in the pharmaceutical sector specifically, and also in IT, you have, Tech Mahindra acquiring UK-based target group. So you have all these companies that are going out seeking specific technologies, new technologies, looking at growth markets. And I think the reason that I think Indian corporates have actually come into their own is because most Indian companies want to diversify their risk. Their risk from the Indian markets, they want to become more global players. It's just an integrated world economy now. And I think any Indian company has aspirations to either be abroad or is abroad. And I think that's true of every company.
Rajeev, if you look at the Modi regime which came to power, it came to power with the agenda of ushering in new landmark reforms. To a great extent, it's done that when it comes to creating a facilitative atmosphere back home in India. And of course, ease of doing business is one of the government's strongest mantras. So would you credit the government's economic policies for a surge in Indian corporates shopping abroad in terms of outbound M&A? Or do you think that's contributed to their openness to shop abroad?
I don't see any empirical evidence to substantiate that the government's policies, except for the fact that they have made outbound investment easier now. In the sense the caps are not there. They had reduced in 11-12, the cap has gone up again. But I think it's more of the opportunities there. I mean, if I put the whole thing backwards, the ease of doing business in that country is what is going to make the Indian investor go in that country, one. Two, I think it's very important that there is an opportunity both in benefits and profits coming out of that investment, which is important. And in that case, the exchange control plays a very important role, which is, of course, within the powers of the government and the Reserve Bank of India. That if the exchange rate is strong, Indian rupee is stronger, obviously the cost of the assets or acquisitions abroad are much easier. And last but not the least, I think what was mentioned by my colleague was that the issues pertaining to arbitration, issues pertaining to legal agreements, documentation, and doing the business, the culture of doing the business is a very critical factor when any corporate decides to acquire something overseas.
All right, Shahana, you heard out Rajeev. He's not necessarily convinced that there can be a strong connection between the government's policies and, the confidence of Indian corporates to look out for overseas assets. Do you concur?
I actually think that the government has actually done quite a bit. And I think Rajeev was saying sort of the same thing. For example, if you look at a concrete example of the RBI actually allowing Indian corporates to increase their borrowing limits to 400% of their net worth as opposed to 100%, which was before. I mean, that's a considerable increase. So there are certain things like that. Or, for example, allowing limited liability partnerships to undertake financial commitments on behalf of their wholly owned subsidiaries or joint ventures abroad. I mean, these are the kind of things the government has been doing to increase the facilitate Indian companies to acquire abroad. But also, I think Prime Minister Modi's trips abroad. So, for example, his engagement with Latin America right after his election in 2014, things like that have led to a tremendous impetus to Indian companies to actually look at those geographies much more closely.
Rajeev, what about the RBI's liberalized remittance scheme? US $250,000 per person per year. How do you see this impacting the investment climate?
See, this is more for individuals, and it is only benefiting individuals who want to either do a small business or invest in other countries for stock market or for their own house. So that has a very limited thing in the overall thing. It is basically the 400% increase in allowed by Reserve Bank of India and allowing the limited partners to go. And also, I think she rightly mentioned that the visibility of India overseas has been very, very huge in the last 2 years. And if you attributed that to the government coming, which has made a huge amount of impact, both for the Indian corporates to have visibility overseas and the overseas companies which Indians can buy. So I think indirectly you can say that the government has been facilitating this.
Ashok, that's a fair point, right? Since the government has come in, there's been so much of attention on, on India as an investment destination, on Indian corporates, and therefore perhaps when it comes to overseas jurisdictions, there's just that much more extra that about the Indian company, which could potentially be chasing you.
I think definitely the PR that Mr. Modi has done over the last couple of years has been fantastic. I think Indian corporates as well as Indians have fairly high profile in the last 20 years. And if you look in the M&A space, it was unusual for Indian corporates to do M&A overseas. It was only the government doing M&A or some large conglomerates. Over the last 20 years, you have lots of different companies doing transactions overseas. They're taken seriously, they get financing, they're actually approached by investment banks and by other intermediaries that show them targets. Now, that didn't happen before, so clearly there is a much more confidence in an Indian corporate actually coming to the table, getting to a deal and executing and closing the deal.
Shahana, quick word from you on the funding aspect.
For me, the world has fundamentally changed after Brexit, the Trump election, and demonetization. And I think going forward, and this is, I think, true for the next 6 months to a year, till the markets, the volatility actually goes down, I think there's going to be a lot of Indian corporates waiting to see what happens, because you can't price it. An M&A deal takes 4 to 6 months to price, and you can't price when you have such volatility in the markets, number one. Number two, I think the Trump election in particular is going to have consequences, which I think everyone is going to wait to see how his election strategy versus his actual governance plays out. So in terms of his policies, for example, just very quickly, the fact that he is going to tighten up H-1B visas is going to lead to a lot of IT companies like TCS, Wipro, Sifi, all of them, to actually buy a lot of US companies and hire a lot of local Americans, for example. So I think the strategy is going to change quite a bit going forward.
All right, Shahana, thanks for your take on the funding bit and the strategic bit. But on that note, it's time to slip into a short break, but keep watching ET now, and the Law Street will return on the other side of this short break. Welcome back to the Law Street. Now let's take a look at some of the key factors that corporates need to take in mind when they decide and finalize an overseas acquisition. Ashok, what are some of the key issues or the key safeguards that Indian companies need to keep in mind when they evaluate an overseas acquisition, be it in terms of cultural fits, be it in terms of diligence issues? We have seen a few overseas acquisitions going down the drain because of lack of proper diligence. So what would you have to say?
I think that first and foremost, it goes back to knowing exactly what it is you want to buy and why you want to buy it. So you need sort of a good strategic vision as to how this asset fits into your overall plans. And once you have that, then you sort of need to do the basic groundwork. I mean, it's the advice that we provide to clients coming into India as well as going out, is get some industry knowledge, talk to your compatriots and colleagues and others in the industry where you want to acquire, and get to know the lay of the land. A lot of times people don't appreciate fully that doing a deal in India or in Africa is quite different from doing it in a different African country versus doing it in Indonesia or in the developed market, that there's discrete issues that deal with just that country. So the fact that it's developed versus non-developed doesn't really make much of a difference. The other thing to do, and this is not meant to be self-serving, is to have really good advisors, that you get those advisors involved early.
And in those jurisdictions as well.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
So that you reduce your risk.
Oh, absolutely. In those jurisdictions, because whether it's financial, tax, or legal, you need to make sure that when you actually structure the transaction, talk about what it is you intend to achieve.
Because you will know your home pitch better than the advisor in the other country.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And you have to think about issues such as cultural issues. You have to think about sort of post-merger integration. A lot of times people look at the asset saying, hey, I bought this company, fantastic, I'm done. As most people know, that's the start of the job, that you need to actually figure out how you're going to integrate that company into your operations, how does it fit in, And that's much harder than buying the company. You have to look at compliance issues, making sure that you do the diligence to make sure, the diligence to make sure that you're not buying something which you'll have a lot of surprises. So you do your due diligence, but then also plan for after the closing, what are you going to do, and what sort of controls and other things you'll put in to make sure that that asset actually achieves the benefits and that you have full control over it in a manner in which you know what the risks are.
Shahana, what are your thoughts on some of the trends in the diligence front? In a lighter vein, no matter how much diligence you do, it eventually boils down to the trust between the two promoters. But since we're on the topic of diligence, what are some of the areas where you have seen corporates, tightening their belts, becoming way more warier than what they were earlier?
I think Indian corporates have to understand, for example, in developed economies, especially the US and UK and Europe, you have you have to really look at their litigation orientation. And by that I mean that these are very highly litigious societies, and the risk of litigation is very high. So for example, if you have consumer products, you really have to think through the litigation environment there. And also in terms of enforcement of contracts, the rule of law, the role of compliance, as my colleagues pointed out. I think it's very important to understand the importance of that and also the risks associated with that. And the second part is also around the way that the societies look at labor. So for example, in the US again, trade unions have a major role to play in, for example, in manufacturing entities. They're also tied very politically to different parties. So I think again, that along with political risk issues, along with also intellectual property issues, that if you're looking into a jurisdiction, you really have to understand what is the brand value, is your IP protected properly or not. So all these issues, I think you have all your legal advisors. You're absolutely right. You have your legal, you have your tax, you have, people even get investigators who look into consumers and look into brand value perceptions from the outside. You can do all of that, but there is an element of no matter how prepared you are, in a way you have to be prepared for the unprepared. So, for something happening regardless. And I think it's the way to mitigate those risks, which I think if you have really good advisors in the jurisdictions to help you, I think that really gives you the comfort to go ahead with acquisitions.
Fair enough. Ashok, now let's move on from due diligence, which is clearly becoming much more wider with every passing day. Now let's look at raising capital abroad. Your thoughts on the entire environment in which Indian companies are now raising capital abroad. How easy is it?
Oh, I think it's gotten a lot easier over the years. The choices that people have now compared to before is significantly greater, and it really is now a decision on what's sort of the best venue, best sort of cost of capital, what sort of security do I use, and within that sort of mix of raising capital, you have probably a bit less borderless and seamless sort of market now where you can raise capital in multiple jurisdictions. Cross-border IPOs have gotten a lot easier. People, when they're making a decision, it's not just I have to list in India anymore. It's what makes the most sense for me from a company perspective, from the goals I want to achieve, such as liquidity, valuations, where do my peers list, and looking at all those things. They're not looking at being restricted to India, but at the same time, you also have a lot more options of what sort of security you want to use. So you could do an IPO, have equity. You could do convertibles. Now in India, you've got the option of masala bonds, which again have a different risk portfolio than, let's say, a high yield bond or doing just a straight US dollar bond.
But what's driving Indian companies to look at these opportunities overseas rather than be conservative and stick to India? What's really driving them?
I think the optionality is driving them, and the decision making. The more options you have, the more choices and more things you can do. A lot of, for example, the acquisitions, if they're overseas, they're dollar assets or they're sort of foreign currency denominated assets, your foreign business, and you want to match your costs and your expenses and sort of investment in that same currency. You also have, sometimes it's easier to borrow because of local regulations with a certain vehicle. So, for NBFCs, it's easier for them to do masala bonds. They may not have the same sort of optionality to do a straight conventional note or just borrow from a foreign bank. So, the mix of securities and what sort of restrictions are placed on obtaining or financing through those securities, but also, what they want to achieve and what makes the most sense from a cost of capital perspective and flexibility.
True. Rajeev, dual listing, companies trying to list offshore, he also referred to masala bonds. What's your experience in this regard, and how actively are some companies doing it?
Dual listing, I think we don't have great experience on this, but I have one at least example. Standard Chartered is one bank which is listed in India, it's listed in London and also in Singapore, Hong Kong. But the value of that has not actually come. Because when you put the exchange rate, then the valuation, why do you do dual listing? So that you can take benefit of the liquidity in the jurisdiction where you are listing. But that has not really shown anything, and that's the reason for last 4 or 5 years, there have not been many companies who have decided to go for dual listing and take the advantage of liquidity in the two jurisdictions.
Now it's time for the last question of the show, and this is something that Shahana has referred to on frequent occasions earlier in the show, and that is the entire Brexit dilemma. How do you think Brexit in any way can impact outbound M&A appetite of Indian companies?
I would say that there is going to be a reasonable amount of opportunity for India's ODI. The reason being that the whole equation under the Brexit is going to change. I don't know what's going to happen in Italy going forward. Yeah. Which, when I say that, I'm taking cue from the 2008 experience, where there was a certain surge in the ODI investment out of India, because Indian corporates found huge opportunity to pick up assets which were reasonable in cost at that point in time. One. Second, there are a large number of sectors of Indian corporates which have got a good enough inroads into the Brexit geographies. So I personally feel that acquisitions happen either to enhance your footprint of the market or to get opportunity to produce at a lower cost. So my view is that Brexit is going to give both the opportunities.
All right, Ashok, before I move on for the last word with Shahana, are you as optimistic as Rajeev about the ripple effects of Brexit?
I probably agree with the first part that it is looking into a crystal ball. But I do think that India itself, because of the positioning and the growth and the demographics, that there's a lot of bilateral treaties that will be signed, and that it's going to be a matter of dealing with the facts as they present themselves when the Brexit actually occurs. And hopefully by that time we've prepared well enough to make that a non-event. It will be disruptive, but I think we're positioned well in terms of just any sort of uncertainty.
All right, Shahana, I'll leave the last word to you. What are some of the pros and cons of Brexit from outbound M&A?
I actually am a little more pessimistic. I think it's going to take a while for this. I think it's a trifecta. I mean, you have Trump on one side, you have Brexit, you have demonetization in India, as I mentioned. You also have, I think, the sentiment across the world, which is a much more protectionist regime of all countries. So, for example, Trump is now talking about make in the US. And Brexit, for a lot of people who voted for it, meant that the immigrants were going to leave. So the thing is that I think the sentiment is going to be much more protectionist across countries. I think it would be interesting to see how it actually translates into policies that these governments implement. And given that, I think Indian outbound investment will have to sort of make those adjustments. So I think it's going to be a bit of wait and watch mode for the next 6 months to 1 year till things actually get flushed out.
Wait and watch mode. Shahana, Rajeev and Ashok, it was indeed a pleasure chatting with all three of you. And thanks so much for taking out time and joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Law Street. Stay tuned to ET Now for more news and updates.
On behalf of Legally Consulting, I must thank all of you for your support and encouragement to make this a big success. We will be back soon with Season 2, The Law Street, with some more interesting episodes. I'm very grateful to ET Now, eminent speakers, and my team who has worked so hard to make this happen. See you soon. Thank you.